All right, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining us today for our Friday webinars. Today, we're going to be we're led by our very own Dr. Laura Lee Hall with our SHC division at NMQF. And I hear that I have a lot of background noise, so I'm going to go ahead and let Dr. Hall take over immediately. She's a smarter one anyway.
Well, I am the older one. So, hi everyone. I see folks are coming on board. I'll share my slides as you do so. Thank you for making time to continue learning and working to promote health equity. The name of our presentation today with a very special speaker, Dr. Richard Harris, is Vaccines and Beyond, Promote and Protect Your Health in 2022. So let me do a little bit of introductory comments if you'll bear with me. So do you remember, it's almost a month ago now, I mean, how can that be, that we were doing this, counting down 10, 9, 8, and I'm sure many of us, just like myself, resolved something, probably having to do with better health. I haven't done so well this January, but I'm thinking there's a few days left. So, we work with really thousands of health champions around the country who are just dedicated people from all walks of life to promote health equity. And what we hear time and time again from these community leaders and groups especially is that we need to get beyond COVID vaccination talk. It's not the only thing that is of concern in many communities of color. And there is also some trepidation that some of the community-based engagement strategies implemented during this hopefully soon to kind of wane COVID pandemic, that they're just going to disappear, and even the whole focus on health equity will dissipate. So, reminder, let's just talk about flu, because flu season goes until March, the end of March typically. The highest flu months are typically February, December, January, and March in that order. So when you look at the CDC statistics that are tracking the rates of flu vaccination this year, the disparities are astonishing. I mean, really disheartening. Of course, there have always been vaccine and flu vaccine disparities. But you look at the difference between non-Hispanic Black children compared with white children, 40 versus 51%. This number here scares me tremendously given the maternal health risk that so many Black women face, that they are only vaccinated 28.2% versus 50.9%. And that really, indeed, all people of color have a 15%, adults, I should say, all adult people of color have a 15% lower percent vaccine rate than the white population, which is only at 45%. So, reminder how far we probably have fallen this year. So I want to invite all of you to go to this web address up here. I'm going to show it again, and I'll put it in the chat box, and get these flyers, posters that we created to use in your practice setting or in your health community communications settings to remind people who haven't been vaccinated, it's not too late. Getting a vaccine now is going to help through the remainder of the flu season. I also want to invite everyone on this call and all of your colleagues to become a health champion. And again, this is the website that you can go to. And we are going to be pushing out a LinkedIn badge that you can access, and it will be apparent on your certifications on your LinkedIn page. You can put it in your email address box. It will announce to the world that you are a health champion working to promote health equity and health for all. So please, again, sign up. There's something that everyone can do, no matter what your profession or background. Here's some examples. Barbers and hairdressers. You can really talk to your customers, educate them, get the healthcare providers into your shops to give vaccines, for example, or do some diabetes education. Additionally, if you're a pharmacist, we have a wonderful program that we've developed in collaboration with Nova Scripts that helps pharmacists um, be able to communicate in the community. You are pharmacists on the call, and any of your colleagues. We know how expert you are. We know how you're more available geographically. Um, with a little bit of training, we think you can get out there and be an amazing promoter of health equity and health. And you do get a certificate from this program. You see, there's these little codes that you can do. If you're a church leader or someone who works in the pastoral care group at a church, join the Faith Health Alliance. You can engage your community, give them a voice about their healthcare needs, and educate them and connect the dots in your community. So these are some versions of what a health champion can be. We have an online free quality improvement education toolkit that you can use in your practice or health system or FQHC to really implement changes that will help you better serve your patients. I can't tell you strongly enough, you are essential to achieving health equity in every zip code of our country. So please, here's that little URL again. Become a health champion. You can email us at shc@nmqf.org as well. Now let's get to the meat of the program. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Richard E. Harris, and he is a board certified internal medicine physician. He's a pharmacist, he's an MBA, but he has taken all that expert background and his knowledge and commitment to evidence-based healthcare and really made sure that the patient or the client is the center of the relationship in healthcare. Indeed, I think he even empowers all of us who seek healthcare to be informed, take ownership of our lives so that we can be healthier. And that taps directly into the inclusion of vaccines and protection from the flu and COVID. So vaccines and beyond, promote and protect your health in 2022. Let's make our New Year's resolutions before the end of this month actually last. One final note, put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll have ample time at the end to answer questions. Remember to register for the NMQF Summit, which is coming up in April. And please nominate a 40 under 40 health leader by mid-February. I believe it's February 14th. It's a really big recognition that has identified and honored and actually been improved under the leadership of many young health leaders in our country. So I'm going to stop sharing with that. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Harris. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. All right. So we're going to be talking about vaccines, of course, about COVID. That's on everybody's mind right now. But we're also going to be talking about some alternative health strategies that I don't think should be alternative. They should be mainstream. But I always like to start off any talk by saying, I'd like to thank my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, by allowing me to come and speak with you guys today. And then I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out to invest in your knowledge and to be a part of this discussion. So a little bit about me. I am a internal medicine physician. I am a pharmacist. I focus more on lifestyle medicine. I have an online little boutique practice that focuses lifestyle medicine, metabolic health, gut health. I also have a podcast where I talk about all things health and wellness. I do a lot of consulting for healthcare startups, also with supplement companies, and I do investing. We have a social impact investing fund. And to me, this is really the essence of how I want to practice medicine, because I think a physician is more than just being at the bedside. And I think we're starting to see that, realize that we can't solve everything at the bedside. And we need to know more about people's habits, what's in their homes, their mindset, their associations, their friend cycles. All of these things impact our health. Now, one of the things that we're going on right now is, of course, Omicron. And one of the questions that we have is vaccine efficacy. Actually, this data I pulled from the CDC was released earlier this week. So this is hot off the presses. Of course, the current recommendation is that all persons 12 or older receive a third dose of the mRNA vaccines 5 months after the second dose, and immunocompromised people should receive a third primary dose. Now, one of the questions that we get all the time is, how effective is the vaccines for Omicron, right? That's a question we get for every new variant. And this data, both Delta and Omicron periods, a third vaccine dose was 94% effective at preventing urgent care visits for the third vaccine for Delta, and 82% for Omicron, and then 94% for Delta for hospitalizations and 90% for Omicron. So still very effective numbers. After 2 doses of the vaccine for both urgent care and ED and emergency department visits, Delta shows at 86% after 14 to 180 days. And after that, it was 76%. But we saw a significant decrease after 2 doses for Omicron, 81%, and then 57% for that 14 to 179 days, and then after 180 days. So this is where the recommendation came from to get that third booster. Now, one of the questions I get is, what about a 4th dose? What about a second booster? And we don't know. There's only one preprint study that I've looked at out of Israel, and it showed that the antibody levels increased by 5-fold after a second booster, but there was no protection. It didn't help prevent hospitalizations or people getting infected by Omicron, which is interesting. Mostly because we don't have the Omicron specific vaccines yet. They're being worked on. But the question will be, will they be needed by the time the vaccines are ready? Because of how many people are getting COVID these days. 40% of Texas, where I live, has already been infected. So those numbers are creeping up. A study came out 2 days ago from England showing that 66% of the Omicron infections in their population were reinfections. So these people are already having protection from natural immunity, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the things I want to talk about vaccine efficacy, because I'm a holistic doctor, is my approach is I'm going to optimize all the tools that I possibly have. And vaccination is one tool. But vaccines are not as effective in certain areas of the population. For instance, if you are obese, obesity is about 42% of the population. Now it's expected that half of adults in the US will be obese by 2025. That's very, very soon. And we know obesity is linked to all different kinds of adverse health effects: cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure, strokes, heart attacks, Alzheimer's, you name it. Also, hypertension. 50% of American adults have hypertension. Dyslipidemia. 21% of American adults have dyslipidemia. Why am I mentioning these things? Because there was a study showing that vaccine titers were lower in this patient population compared to people who didn't have them. And there's data from other vaccines showing the same thing. So our vaccines are not as efficacious in people who have metabolic disorders. And that makes sense. You need a highly functioning or fully functioning immune system to optimize the effect of a vaccine. And if you don't have a optimal metabolic health, you're not going to see the biggest effect of the vaccine. And so going forward, that's very concerning because these numbers continue to increase. So as these lifestyle conditions and metabolic conditions increase, our therapies are becoming less effective. Now let's look at why is Omicron different? Why is the vaccines less effective? Well, it has over 30 mutations in the spike protein. We know the spike protein is how it gains entry into cells using the ACE receptor. But it also has 20 other mutations in other important proteins. And the data is showing that it escapes neutralization antibodies. And this is why everybody's freaking out. I think we're doing a disservice by only functioning on antibodies. That's only one part of the immune system. We have data, we're going to talk about this in a minute, on T cells. Now, what we're seeing is it's more transmissible. The R naught is still being worked out. We know the R naught for flu is usually 1 to 2. If you looked at the R naught for the ancestral or the OG COVID, it was 2 to 5. Delta was around 7. The reports I'm reading say the R naught for Omicron is about 10. So one person who gets Omicron is likely to infect 10 people. It's become more transmissible. However, it's less severe on average. And if you look at data from South Africa, because they've already had their Omicron peak, there were less hospitalizations and less deaths in this COVID spike. And then we're starting to see similar data here in the US that it is less severe. But you have to take that in context because more people are getting it. We're still seeing a lot of hospitalizations, but those hospitalizations are trending to people spending less time in the hospital and getting less severe disease. And that's very important because one of the things that we didn't focus on enough early in the pandemic was the length of time people stayed in the hospital. I was a hospital physician when the pandemic first hit. I worked in the hospital for 1.5 years when the pandemic first hit. And, we were seeing people in the hospital regularly for 20, 25 days. Hospitals are just not designed to have that type of capacity to keep people there that long. And then there was nowhere to put them afterwards. They couldn't go to rehab facilities. And we know that there can be a lot of musculoskeletal issues, autonomic issues after COVID. That's a whole different conversation for another day. But having people spend less time in the hospital is a very good thing. So we already alluded to this. Is this as bad as it seems? And I jumped ahead. I kind of do that. I'm very random. But data out of South Africa is showing less severe disease, less hospitalization. There's a study out of Hong Kong that showed that Omicron replicates about 70 times more in the upper airways. And there are animal studies that corroborate these findings. And this is a good thing. So the ancestral alpha and delta replicated more in the lower airways, causing a pneumonia. And that's more severe disease. We know if you've been around medicine, even young people in their 20s can get a pneumonia and get very sick and end up in the hospital. Upper airways, bronchitis, people tend to not get hospitalized or as sick from a bronchitis. And so that's a good thing. And if you look at the course of viruses over time, they tend to get more transmissible and less severe, less deadly, less virulent. And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. We're the host, right? Viruses can only live inside of us. And if you get really good at killing off your host, well, guess what? You've just killed yourself off as well. And we can even see this with Ebola. Ebola has become less deadly over time. And that's because it gets more transmissible. So it's able to spread. It's able to increase its life cycles without causing a significant injury or damage to the host, which is ideal for the virus. Now, one of the things that we're seeing all the time now is T cells. You're starting to see all these reports on T cells, even though scientists have been studying T cells with vaccination and natural immunity for a while. There's lots of papers on the T cell effect. Now, of course, we're interested with T cells in Omicron because that's what's going on now. If you look at data from the other variants, there was a robust T cell response to both infection and vaccination. And that's really good because as the spike protein mutates, our current treatments may not be as effective. And we've seen that with the monoclonal antibodies, right? The FDA actually just said to stop using Eli Lilly and Regeneron's products because the data is showing that it's not effective. However, what is it? So tirabimab, it has a different binding spot than the other antibodies. And GlaxoSmithKline says it's more conserved. So that appears to still have some effectiveness, but it is reduced. I believe the one study I read said it was 20 or 30% reduction in effectiveness. GlaxoSmithKline, their data, what they're putting on their website says it's still just as effective. So that's something that's in ongoing study. And this is a really interesting time, right? Because we're building the road as we're driving on it. So a lot of this data is preprint. It's a lot of it is not peer reviewed. And, you know, we have to take it with a grain of salt, but it's the best that we can do as we're trying to get ahead of this thing, is get information out there to people making decisions so they can try to make the best decisions. So back to Omicron, let's take a look at T cell response to Omicron. There's a couple papers that have shown a significant T cell response to Omicron via previous vaccination or through natural immunity. And this is very, very important. In fact, a lot of these papers, the authors speculate that the reason that the Omicron surge in South Africa wasn't as bad is because of T cell based immunity. And T cells are kind of the forgotten thing here. Everybody's focused on antibodies and neutralizing antibodies. And that's not what we should solely be focused on. Now, it's easier to measure that. That's why people are focused on these. It's a lot harder, especially for consumer purposes, to measure T cell responses. It's a lot more costly to also research these things. But we are getting a robust T cell response. And that's important because the data is looking like the T cell response is more conserved. And the reason for this is when you get vaccine-based immunity, you're getting a monoclonal-based population of antibodies, right, to whatever is in that vaccine. In this case, it's the spike protein. And the new vaccines are going to change around the composition of the antibodies based upon the Omicron spike protein, right? But T cells, and this is going back to basic immunology, when they get presented antigens, they're not just getting presented one antigen, they're getting presented multiple parts of the virus. And so they are able to recognize different parts of the virus, different proteins like the nucleocapsid. And you can actually measure nucleocapsid antibodies. They tend to decrease faster than spike protein antibodies. But over time, you're going to decrease antibodies anyway. That's what's going to happen. Why? Because it's expensive to produce. We have to think about our white blood cells are highly metabolic cells, and you need building blocks to make all of these antibodies. You need proteins, you need gene expression. And so you're not going to keep pumping out high levels of antibodies unless you're getting repeat exposure all the time. If you're not getting exposed, your body's going to drop the antibodies down to a minimum threshold. And that's what happens over that 6 to 8 month period. But we're also forgetting about the memory cells, memory T cells, memory B cells. These cells are specifically there to remember. That's why they're called memory. And when you get re-exposed to a virus or bacteria, they activate, and they activate much quicker than the first time that you get exposed. And so this is why we have to take this all of this into consideration. Again, take a holistic approach. Antibody levels are going to decline. That's what's supposed to happen. But we still are seeing robust T cell responses in people who had a different variant to Omicron. And that's very important. And that's showing the power of natural immunity. In fact, if you look at the recent CDC data, actually showed that natural immunity was more protective in Delta infections than vaccination. And that makes sense because the virus has accumulated mutations in the spike protein over time. But we're saying T cells are targeting more conserved epitopes or protein signatures on the virus. So as you know, you can't directly extrapolate this, but it makes sense from a scientific perspective that as we go on to future variants, the natural immunity will still be protective because of it T cells recognizing these conserved protein structures. And in fact, early on in the pandemic, I read a study that people who had SARS-CoV-1 had a pretty significant T cell response to SARS-CoV-2. So even between the different types, there was still some cross protection and cross reactivity, and that's a good thing. Another thing about multiple boosters is you have to worry about inducing autoimmunity. There's some older studies that show that the more you get exposed to one specific type of antigen, the more likely you are to get a dysregulated immune response. And so that's one of the things I'm worried about, is if we give people 5, 6, 7, 8 boosters to the same, basically the same antigen, are we going to induce a lot of autoimmunity? And autoimmunity is on the rise. 1 in 5 Americans have an autoimmune disease now. That's largely due to our lifestyle. We'll talk about that at the end. I already covered this. Like I said, jump around. One of the things we get asked about is, well, what variant do I have? How come you're not telling me what variant I have? How come you're not testing this? Well, as a clinician, I'm not testing this. I don't have any way to test this, but the organizations are testing a certain amount of the positive cases and reporting that data to the CDC. But from a consumer perspective, the variant you have is not really relevant to the overall treatment. Now, you can kind of ballpark this, right? And you can look at it from when the levels were spiked. We have the ancestral from January 2020 to December 2020. Alpha, I actually got sick with Alpha probably in December 2020 to December 2021. And then Omicron started to peak and take over December 2021 till now. And I actually got Omicron too, and I'm vaccinated, but high exposure rates. Okay. So what happened to the flu? You're seeing this all over the place. People, conspiracy theorists acting all crazy, saying that, oh, we just rebranded the flu to something else. And then my response to them is, diagnosis is not a linear thing. And what I mean by that is diagnosis is Bayesian. What you do is you take all available data and it either supports a diagnosis or it doesn't. What I mean by that is, early on in the pandemic and even now, I didn't just rely on a COVID test to say someone had COVID, because we know that COVID tended to act more like a syndrome. There were other markers, chest x-ray findings, elevated D-dimer. I had seen CRPs higher than I had ever seen CRPs and ESRs, inflammatory markers with COVID. I mean, 200, 300 on the regular for people who had COVID. And so that's what I mean by a Bayesian approach, is where you taking all of this aggregated data together and looking at that to support a diagnosis. And we don't see these type of things with flu. Now, flu cases were still out there, right? And people quickly forgot that like 2017, 2018, and 2019 were some of the worst flu seasons on record. We had massive numbers of people getting sick by the flu. Co-infection was rare. It did happen. One meta-analysis from last year showed a 0.7% co-infection rate. Now, what we know is the flu is less contagious. And I already talked about these R0 values earlier. So when someone gets the flu, they're typically going to infect 1 or 2 other people. Now, the other thing is, early on, the flu has a much shorter incubation period, meaning that when you get exposed to the flu, you're going to get sick a lot sooner. You're going to feel sick a lot sooner. And, I don't know how many of you have had the flu, but when you have the flu, it hits you like a train. Like, you go to bed one night, you wake up the next morning and you feel like death. And when you feel like death, you're typically not going to go into the office. Whereas COVID, we saw incubation periods, 7 days, 10 days, 14 days were before people were symptomatic. And so that makes it easier to spread. That's one of the reasons. Another thing is that because flu is not as contagious, all the measures that we took to protect, masks, social distancing, are more likely to affect flu numbers than COVID numbers. Also, it could be, and we don't know, these are just theories, right, that flu outbreaks in previous years are providing cross immunity. We know that even if we don't get the actual vaccine completely correct for the flu, that there still is some cross reactivity and cross protection, like we talked about with those conserved protein structures, those conserved epitopes. This year's flu vaccine, it's really hard to tell, right? Because we're just not seeing that many flu numbers. There is a preprint study out that shows that one of the flu components, the H3N2 for the influenza A, is mismatched. There were 2 updates to the vaccine in the H1N1 and the H3N2 for the influenza A this year. And we did update it after the Southern Hemisphere flu vaccine came out. Why is that important? Well, flu affects the Southern Hemisphere first, right? Because their winter is our summer and our summer is their winter. And so we will look at what's going on there to determine what we should do with our vaccines. But we're just not seeing that many cases. And this is data I pulled from the CDC yesterday to take a look at the current numbers. Last year's 1.8, 3.1 million flu cases, in this flu season, with 1,800 to 3,800 hospitalizations. It's really kind of hard to tell with everything going on, and plus people are more focused on COVID, but there still is some flu out there. I personally, as a clinician, have not seen that much flu. I don't think I've diagnosed a flu case in 3 years personally, but I know there are some cases out there. There still is flu. Flu didn't go anywhere. It's just for probably a large number of reasons, the cases have come down. Okay. Now, I'm a holistic doc. Like I said, I'm a lifestyle medicine doc. And like we mentioned earlier, if I'm going to use a therapy, I want to maximize that therapy and make it as efficacious as possible. And you can't do that with anything in medicine without addressing lifestyle medicine. Now, a study from 2021, we'll get to that. Nutrition is literally the most important thing about health. The most important decision you make every single day regarding your health is what are you putting in and on your body, by far. Nutrition fills our building blocks. And our body can only make the quality of the things that it needs to make based upon the quality of the foods that we eat. And we know that most Americans eat a large amount of processed food. Studies show between 60 to 70% of the average American's intake of total calories is processed food. Processed food intake is linked to cancer and diabetes and inflammation and obesity and mental health disorders, you name it. So how does nutrition impact COVID? There was a study from last year that showed that high quality nutrition, and most of the time when these nutrition studies are looking at things as far as high quality, what they mean by that is something close to the Mediterranean nutrition plan. I don't use diet. I hate the word diet. Diet has such a negative connotation. I don't have a diet. I have a nutrition plan. So I have a plan that fuels my body for what it needs and what I need to do. So most of the time when you look at these studies, what they consider a high quality nutrition plan is very similar to the Mediterranean nutrition plan. That reduced the risk of infection by 9% and severe infection by 41%. Astronomical numbers. Concerning millions of people have been infected, these are millions of touch points, millions of lives that could be impacted by better quality nutrition. Because like I said, it determines everything. It determines your immune system. It determines your clotting. It determines your cardiac function, everything. And one of the things about nutrition is it's complex, right? But you can keep it very simple. What I tell people to keep nutrition very simple is just eat real food. And what do I mean by that? Eat like your grandma used to eat. What did grandma eat? Meats, fruits, veggies, nuts. What did grandma cook with? Olive oil, lard, tallow, butter, real products that aren't chemically transformed. If you do that, that's like 80% of nutrition right there. If you look at some of the data, most Americans overeat carbohydrates. Up to 70% of total calories in the standard American diet can be carbohydrates. Most Americans do not get enough protein and do not get enough good fats. And this is causing a lot of systemic dysregulation, leading to insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is the root cause of diabetes and a host of other diseases. I just saw recently about 13.5% of the population is now diabetic, with likely another 30 to 40% insulin resistant. That's astronomical numbers. And that number is continuing to increase year after year after year. We don't have a metformin deficiency. We have lifestyle problems. You can't just treat lifestyle issues with medication. I'm a pharmacist, right? I've forgotten more about medications than most doctors have ever learned. And I know when to use the meds appropriately, what they do, and what they can't do. You can't overcome someone's bad lifestyles with medications. And part of the problem, and I'm just being blunt here, is that we put all the onus to health on the doctor. My job is to diagnose you. My job is to give you the right information. I cannot cure you because I'm not with you in the home 24/7 seeing all the decisions you make. There has to be some personal accountability in health, and that's missing. Exercise and movement, so important. I think it's about 6% of people, if I'm remembering the data correctly, get enough exercise by the guidelines, and that's 75 minutes of vigorous exercise, 150 minutes of moderate exercise per week. That's nothing. 75 minutes a week is absolutely nothing. There's about 120 waking hours for most of us a week. One study showed inactive patients compared to patients who met the guidelines had an odds ratio of 2.26 for hospitalization, 1.73 for ICU, and 2.49 for death. These are massive increased risk. In fact, a study came out last week that showed that if Americans got 10 minutes of exercise a day, it would save 112,000 lives a year. If you got 30 minutes of exercise a day, it would save almost 270,000 lives a year. In fact, for men, that 10 minutes of exercise a day would save 8% of premature deaths for men. 10 minutes. 8% of premature deaths, astronomical numbers for such a simple intervention. Yet no public policy for exercise, no public policy for nutrition, even though these are numbers showing massive differences. Toxin avoidance. We live in a very toxic society. Look at everything that's happened with glyphosate and Roundup. $1 billion settlement for cancer, but that's just one of the problems with glyphosate. It's an endocrine disruptor. It causes alterations in the microbiome, hormones, everything. Endocrine disruptors are linked to dysregulated inflammation. If you can't mount the proper immune response, then you're more likely to have some severe issues with COVID. If your immune system goes too far, it's going to cause a lot of damage. We want our immune system to ramp up, but we don't want it to go too far. So detoxifying the environment, I highly recommend everyone go to EWG, Environmental Working Group. Take a look at the products you're using. Remember what I said, most important decision with health is what you put in and on your body every single day. Know what's in the products you are putting in and on your body. Mindfulness. This is huge. We live in a very stressed society. You don't need to be in healthcare or read data to know that anxiety, depression numbers are through the roof. Child suicide rates are through the roof. ER visits for severe depression and anxiety are through the roof right now. In fact, a CDC study showed that the second highest risk for death from COVID behind obesity was anxiety and fear disorders. A study I just read a couple of days ago showed that higher levels of neuroticism, for every one standard deviation of increased neuroticism on a certain score, you have a 13% increased risk of having greater than 6 cardiometabolic risk factors. Mental health affects our physical health. Our physical health affects our mental health. The two are linked. And so having mindfulness, stress reduction, meditation, breathing exercises is very important. Mindfulness is associated with decreased blood sugar, decreased blood pressures, improved cognition, improved mood, decreased inflammation. And it's simple, right? About an hour a week is what I recommend for mindfulness. Sleep. Sleep hypoxia was associated with a 31% increased risk of hospitalization and mortality, sleep apnea. Sleep is so important for regulating our metabolism, our hormones, our immune system. Another study in healthcare workers found every 1 hour more of sleep was associated with a 12% lower risk of infection. Again, these are massive numbers considering how many people have been infected. And 1 hour of sleep is a simple intervention. Supplements, I get asked on this all the time. What supplements? If you're going to do anything, vitamin D is probably the most important. A meta-analysis showed a 1.77 higher risk of infection, 2.57 higher risk of severe infection, and 2.35 higher risk of death for vitamin D levels. And they use a cutoff of 20. So these numbers are actually probably higher because you're deficient at 30, not 20. I like people's vitamin D levels 50 or 60. Zinc, we know that zinc is very important to the body and the immune system. There's a recent meta-analysis that showed that zinc may prevent respiratory infections and shorten symptom duration for acute respiratory infections. Zinc use was associated with lower inflammatory markers and less kidney injury with COVID. Glutathione and NAC. Glutathione is our body's major antioxidant, major detoxifier. Hospitalized patients, this was a recent study, have increased oxidative stress and severe glutathione deficiency. Glutathione is also very important for making sure your immune system doesn't go too far. It's a big brakes for the immune system, and so is vitamin D. So both of these are necessary for the immune system to ramp up, but also to hit the brakes. Another one that's interesting is quercetin. Quercetin is a powerful antioxidant, anti-inflammatory. It's a zinc ionophore, so it helps bring zinc inside the cells. It decreases dysbiosis, abnormal microbiome. It increases T regulatory cells, which are the brakes. You know, we have the gas in the immune system and the brakes. These are the regulators. And it upregulates sirtuins, which are longevity genes associated with reducing inflammation. And there's clinical studies ongoing right now with quercetin. But if you look at a lot of the holistic protocols, they include that. Okay, rapid fire. But this is my contact info. If you want to get a hold of me, send me an email, listen to my stuff, you know, whatever. But that's just how you get a hold of me if you want to get a hold of me, if you want to learn more about holistic medicine.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Harris. I remind everyone on the call, please enter in your questions into the Q&A box. I guess I'm going to start out with some questions. Oh, wait, we have one here. I'll go with. Okay, the question is regarding sleep hypoxia. How does one know if this is a health concern?
There's a good questionnaire to determine if you probably have sleep apnea. It's called Stop Bang, and you can just Google it and answer the questions yourself, and it'll give you a score. And if the score is above a certain number, this is something that you definitely want to go and talk with your physician about. Sleep apnea and sleep hypoxia is associated with cardiovascular disease, with mental decline, with abnormal blood sugars, abnormal blood pressure. It's a very common reason for a lot of dysfunction, you know, abnormal sleep. So that's something that you can do. Also, I have an Oura Ring, generation 3. It measures your blood oxygen levels. So I can just pull up my app and look and see how my blood oxygen is doing. You know, in normal states, it should be above 92 or above. You know, if you're seeing blood oxygen levels drop, you know, into the 80s, into the 70s when you sleep, that's a big time problem.
Thank you. I want to ask your opinion. I mean, you're a clinician as well as a researcher and a communicator. And you heard me mention, and I think you're well aware of data, that vaccine rates are depressed among people of color generally. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that and how folks like us might want to address it that would be impactful.
So here's the thing about this. If someone doesn't want to get the vaccine, there's nothing you can say to them to convince them, right? It's just not going to happen. You can't convince them with data. You can't convince them with rationale. That's not how human beings work. If my mind is set on something, that's not how it works. The only way that you can do it is understand where they're coming from. You have to understand why they don't want to get the vaccine and what's their association behind that. And you can't change that. You can't change their mind, but you can plant a seed based upon that association. And then if you plant a seed, if you get them to think about it, if you change their association, that's when someone can change their mind. Adam Grant has a really great book about rethinking, and that's what it talks about, is how you plant a seed to get someone to think.
So that's something I've always thought was important, why having a relationship with the primary care team pays dividends in the long run, because there's a relationship and you can plant the seed and nurture it over time. Do you think there are other, who else can be part of the communication strategy to help people understand the benefits and risk of vaccines and make a good decision in terms of protecting themselves and their families? Are there,
Yeah.
other than the doctor?
Yeah, I think it's any trusted healthcare professional, pharmacists. I love health coaches, right? Because so much of our health is based upon our mindset and our associations. And so the health coaches are people who can get down to these associations and mindset, and then help us form new associations and new ways of thinking about things, because it's mostly about perspective, right? And Marion, I see your point. Yes, absolutely. I did mention that. What I meant from it not mattering is from the consumer perspective, right? So people ask, well, what version did I have? And I said, from the consumer perspective, it doesn't matter as much. From the societal perspective, it does matter to monitor rates and to see what the prevailing thing is. But by the time that we would do what we would for an individual, look at the strand and know what strand that person had, most likely they're going to be out of the acute virologic phase at that time. And they're probably in the window where we've missed the window for the monoclonal antibodies to be effective.
That's a very interesting consideration. Um, I I want to ask you, as a person who struggles with obesity, what's the first step? I mean, I want to do it. I try to do it, but I'm not doing it. Can you give, something that could be a tangible first step that could help us all kind of move into immune health?
Yes. So the problem is we as humans tend to start with action, and that's not where you want to start. You want to start with getting absolutely 100% crystal clear on your values. What's important to you? And the reason I say that is because if you just say, well, I want to lose weight, I'm like, well, why do you want to lose weight? Well, I just want to lose weight. You're not going to lose weight. No one's ever lost weight with that kind of thinking. If you say, I want to lose weight because I want to be able to play with my grandkids, or I want to lose weight because I don't want to be a burden to my family members as I get older, or I want to be healthier because I want to be able to bike 20 miles, that's a very powerful why. And so once you determine and get crystal clear on your values and your why, what happens is then you form a new identity around that why. So why health matters to me is because my value system, one of my main values is practicing what I preach. Accountability and authenticity is huge for me. I would never tell someone to do something that I'm not doing myself. And so because that's my why, I have an identity focused around that. And so I tell myself all the time, I am someone who does strength training because health is important to me. I am someone who eats a good nutrition plan because the people in my life deserve the best version of me. I am someone who meditates because people are counting on me to be in the best mental state I can be in to make the best decisions I can make. And so once you have this identity, it becomes really easy to move, because as humans, we always move towards our identity. And so that's where I tell people to start, is get crystal clear on your why, your values, and then form a new identity about it. And then be your own hype man. Tell yourself these stories in your head over and over and over again. And then just do it. Like, there's no better time to start than today. Are you going to have motivation all the time? No. Are you going to feel like doing it all the time? No. Is it hard to be healthy? Yes. Is it hard to be sick? Yes. You get to choose your hard. And I'd rather choose the hard that helps me help other people than the hard that makes me a burden to other people.
What if you live in a community with precious little access to unprocessed food, real food? How does that individual take the step?
Yeah, that's a great question. You do what you can, right, with what you got. Now, nowadays, there are some online services where you can get fruits and vegetables and things like that delivered to your door. There are food pharmacies in certain areas where you can get prescriptions for certain foods. And sometimes even these pharmacies don't charge people for it. There are resources and community resources available for this type of thing. And that's just one area, right? Some of these things are free. Meditation's free. Exercise you can do in your house, that's free. Getting more sleep, that's free, right? So a lot of these interventions, some of them you may not be able to do, but do what you can in your own sphere of influence.
Do you recommend, or when do you recommend seeing a mental health professional? Depression and anxiety seems to be so common in healthcare professionals who have been enduring the stress of caring for others during the pandemic, for people who are essential workers in their families, etc. When is mental health, professional help, a good thing to seek?
I think everyone should see a mental health professional. I think everyone should talk to a therapist at least once. And the reason for that is there's a lot of strong data showing that we carry our childhood traumas on with us to adults. And if you don't unpack that, it can manifest itself as all kinds of problems. I think that's addressing the number one thing. The number two thing is it just helps to talk to someone to get stuff out of your head, because if you just leave stuff in your head, you ruminate, we tend to have a negativity bias, so we just think about negative things all the time. But if you get them out of your head, if you talk to someone, if you put words to your thoughts, a lot of times you'll be like, oh, that was stupid, why did I think that? Or I know that's not true, right? That's why journaling can be so effective. But I think that it's something that is beneficial to anybody, even before you have a crisis, as preventative help. If you know that there's some things that you haven't addressed or some things that still hold some a weight over you, to just go talk to somebody to remove that and move forward.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I want you to pull your crystal ball out. What's happening with COVID this year?
Uh, who knows, right? I think that if you look at Omicron, it's probably the onus in the beginning of this becoming endemic, just because of how many people are getting sick. It's more transmissible, but it's less severe. You have so many people who are already vaccinated and have natural immunity, and if you look at the data for people who have both, it's a very robust response. So if you look at the 7-day moving average, it is trending down again. And I think that's going to continue to be the case. I think if a new variant pops up, it'll be the same thing. Most likely, it'll continue to move more into an upper respiratory type thing, just like all the other cold and coronaviruses and all those other viruses. So hopefully this is the beginning of the end of the pandemic. The problem is, though, Americans are in the worst metabolic health that they've ever been in. And so that puts us at risk for future incidents and future viruses, because there's always going to be another virus, or another bacteria or something like that. Infectious disease has been the number one global killer of men all time, So we have to put ourselves in a position that we're not so susceptible to these types of things. And for people who say, oh, it doesn't matter, there's a study that showed that 63% of the hospitalizations could have been prevented if America was cardiometabolically healthy. That's an astronomical number. So we have to put into more of a focus on preventative health and making sure that we are as healthy as society as possible, because our health has plummeted over the last 60 to 70 years.
And other than educational activities like this and what you do, how on earth are we going to make that happen?
There's a lot that needs to be done, but it all starts with, unfortunately, this is America, right? Consumer dollars speak. So as consumers demand something from organizations, the organizations are forced to move that way. And you are seeing more health options come up, but we all have to be the stewards of our own health. And like I said earlier, we have huge accountability issues. We blame everyone for everything else, but we don't blame ourselves. And it all starts with me. All right. And so I have to take the power back and not rely on someone else to have control. And so I need to control what I can control, do the best that I can do, and then just keep moving forward from there.
Well, I think that is a wonderful way to start, and to remind us that it is America. I think we have a question here that maybe we can wrap up now. What do you suggest for caregivers who are taking care of their loved ones during the pandemic?
You got to carve out time for yourself. It sounds selfish, but it's not selfish, because if you're caring for someone else, you need to make sure that you're in the best possible situation you can be in to really provide the care that they need. Right. And it's just like the airplane, put your mask on before you put someone else's mask on. And so self-love is not selfish. There's a big difference between the two. And this is something that I tell people all the time, is that I put myself first so I can be in the best position to help you when you need help.
That's wonderful. I do see a comment. I know we're at the end of our time, but I'll just, no, it was just thanking you for your wisdom. I think there's a lot of comments here that felt like this was a very refreshing perspective on how we can work to improve health, and improving cardiometabolic health sounds like it's the cornerstone.
Absolutely.
Thank you again. This was fantastic. I wish you good luck. I hope you don't get COVID again, since you've had it twice. And can we share your slides with the people who are on the
Yeah,
call?
I'll email it out to you.
All righty. Thanks to all of you. Please connect up with us. We need your help to help all our folks in the US. Have a great Friday and a football weekend. Bye-bye.